Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring holism and unity as an imperative for survival. My guest is Peter Todd, who is with me from Sydney, Australia, where he is a psychotherapist with a Jungian orientation. Peter is the author of The Individuation of God, Integrating Science and Religion. Welcome, Peter.
Very glad to be with you, Jeffrey, and exploring such significant themes for the future of our planet and humanity.
Indeed, our topic has to do with the survival of humanity, and we are currently, as we speak, in the middle of one of the great extinctions on this planet, and an extinction caused by human activity. We're suffering from all sorts of environmental problems, and you, there in Australia, are right in the midst of a great conflagration right now. Perhaps we could begin by just having you describe what is happening right there where you are in Sydney, Australia.
It's 42 degrees, but for some time it has been a little bit like being in one of the layers of Dante's Inferno. So it's an indication of an anthropogenic contribution to climate change, which is responsible for all of these disasters, as well as the anthropogenic misuse of scientific expertise to develop thermonuclear weapons, which represent another major threat to our survival.
I understand, as we discussed earlier, that 500 million animals, 500 million animals have been destroyed by these fires. And I gather that the pollution from the fires, the smoke, is engulfing the city of Sydney, where you are right now.
I live about 2 miles out of the city, and we can't even see the skyscrapers with the smoke haze.
Where you are in Sydney, Australia, is the epicenter of a very serious problem right now. So it's appropriate that we're talking about what can we do to address these kinds of problems, which to a large degree are created by our own species.
Absolutely. They are anthropogenic in nature, both climate change and all the disasters that are currently befalling the Earth, including this country. And again, I mentioned the imminent danger of thermonuclear war and the destruction of the entire planet, which I personally find very worrying. However, I think we're also here to discuss some possible ways of transforming consciousness individually and collectively so as to mitigate the possible impact of an Armageddon in the near future.
You know that I putting out 3 videos every week. Ultimately, the intention here is to help raise consciousness for the viewers. We're now up to over 70,000. I'd love to see it grow, but it strikes me that if we're dependent on a shift in consciousness, we're in trouble, because that shift seems to be reaching millions of people, but percentage-wise, it's still a very small percentage.
Though we may raise consciousness individually and collectively of the need for unanimization, as they put it, or for a holistic consciousness embracing the earth that is non-local, and also involving a re-spiritualization of a very desacralized planet, that we might find ourselves in the position, as the famous physicist Niels Bohr once put it, of needing to become real actors in the cosmic drama rather than mere spectators feeling passive and helpless and depressed at beholding it all. So I think the challenge is for us to move beyond the very necessary transformation and re-spiritualization of the world into ways of actually acting so as to avert these disasters and perhaps the end of the world, as to how I put it.
Teilhard talked about the omega point. We're going to be doing another interview about that. Some people would say that, the human race is doomed because sooner or later the stars will burn out and the whole universe will collapse on itself. But we're dealing now with much more immediate issues. And I guess if we were to consider holism as something of an antidote to the problems we're facing, it would be useful to begin by defining just what you mean by holism.
Well, I derived that concept from a number of sources, but more specifically from reading the work not only of Teilhard, but of Jung and Pauli and David Bohm and his colleagues with Wholeness and the Infinite Order and the Undivided Universe, and both having their roots in a largely unconscious movement towards not only survival but individuation of the species in connection with a numinous God archetypal self, or unconscious God image, as Jung would put it. I think that's very much lacking, and a restoration of wholeness would involve, among other things, I think, a re-spiritualization of the world and constellating that archetype of the transcendent God archetype that Jung and people like Roderick Mayne more recently have written about.
When you talk about re-spiritualization, it suggests that at one time the world was different than it is now.
I suspect that until the schism between science and religion, which occurred with the Enlightenment, there was probably a more holistic view of the world. And then at that time, however, there were no threats from other theology or science to the future of the planet. However, that situation has been reversed, and Wolfgang Pauli was one of those who wrote a great deal in his collaboration with Carl Jung about the desperate need to restore psyche to science and also to work towards achieving wholeness in the world, if you like, a holism at a collective and human conscious level, not just down at the quantum level, where there's a kind of entanglement between the collective unconscious, which is non-local, and quantum non-locality. I derive my notions of holism from reading those sources, and particularly the collaboration of Jung and Pauli and then David Bohm and his colleagues, and also wanting to really clearly distinguish between a kind of expanded consciousness, but one which is in danger of neglecting the sheer power of the collective unconscious with its archetypes, which are, with the collective unconscious, of course, as Jung put it, is coextensive with the cosmos itself, as indeed he believed the divine was coextensive with the cosmos itself, and that God, if you want to use that word, is co-evolving with us and indeed entangled with us.
Well, it sounds to me as if you're describing a world in which we acknowledge at a global level our interconnectedness with each other and with nature and even with the cosmos as a whole, and that we understand it to be not just some sort of material connection, but a sacred connection based on respect for all life forms.
Respect for all life forms and for the interconnectedness and sacredness of all people and the ecosystems that support them. And as I've suggested probably in some of our earlier interviews, one of the greatest threats to that has been the prevailing and dominant paradigm of materialism in the West, which has allowed people without conscience to feel quite entitled to consume the resources of the earth or to attack other people in the name of various ideologies, whether the collective dialectical materialism of Marx or sometimes some forms of capitalism. Very dangerous materialism because it despiritualizes the world and ourselves, desouls the world, as Jung would put it.
How do you imagine that we can arrive at such an understanding at a global level? Because I'm pretty sure you don't think it can be enforced in a top-down manner. It has to sort of emerge naturally, wouldn't you say?
I absolutely agree. And if we look at the response of, say, the people of this country to the current bushfire emergency, it seems that there is a glowing unity of awareness of the sheer urgency of, if you like, the summons presented to humanity of these disasters which are occurring even now. So as more and more people grasp the reality of the summons and see that they don't have to be mere spectators but possibly actors in responding to the summons, there may be some hope in collectively as well as individually acting in such a way as to reduce these threats to our survival. After all, if climate change is anthropogenic, human beings potentially can act in such a way as to either reverse or halt that, slow it down, and the same applies to thermonuclear war waged in the name of various quasi-religious and materialist ideologies.
I'm under the impression, Peter, that there is an increase in people having spontaneous religious experiences, visitations of the Virgin Mary, visitations even of extraterrestrial beings or alien-seeming non-human life forms, experiences of other dimensions, near-death experiences, that all of this seems to be bubbling up in the culture because we're facing a potential mass extermination.
Well, I would suspect, Jeff, that that's a reaction back from the unconscious to what is happening at a more conscious level. And that could be expressed in activism, or being actors and not spectators, as Niels Bohr put it. And there is some evidence in the world already of global movements, including protests about climate change across the world, to try and act upon the emergency rather than just to let it happen and destroy us. However, I think for that to happen, enough people have to regain a sacramental or spiritual attitude of the world as absolutely sacred and inviolable, almost as a kind of global cathedral, rather than just treating it as something to be consumed to exhaustion and not worrying about future generations, a remarkably egoistic and egocentric, inflated attitude. I won't name personalities, but you and I can probably think of some world leaders who embody that egotism in a very dangerous way. Malignant narcissism is a term that comes to my mind there.
It's a paradoxical situation because people who strive for power are often motivated by what you might think of in yoga terms as the lower chakras. They desire power. They desire control. They want to dominate, and such people often assume the leadership of corporations and governments. We see that seems to be on the increase worldwide.
Absolutely, and I think we had evidence for it with the rise of Hitler as a negative messiah figure in Nazi Germany, with Joseph Stalin, who murdered about the same number of people as happened under the Third Reich, including the extermination of the poor Jewish people. Chairman Mao, with 40 million people exterminated for dissident thought, and that still continues today. People are murdered as dissidents and their organs ripped out whilst they're not anaesthetised and sold on the black market. I mean, how hideous and how sacrilegious an attack upon the human body and the sacredness of who we are.
Many years ago, when I was a young man, I had a conversation with Idries Shah, who was a writer of Sufi stories, very well known for his tales of Mullah Nasruddin. And we discussed this very point, and I expressed to him how urgent I felt the situation was. And this was nearly 50 years ago, actually. And he said, yes, he agreed the situation was urgent even then. But he said, the fact that it's urgent is not the right way to motivate people to achieve a holistic spiritual attitude. It has to come from an open heart, not from a sense of dire urgency.
From an open heart, and a heart that is open to spiritual awakening or connection with some sort of numinous reality, or, as I've spoken about in previous interviews, the dimension of numinous becoming in both cosmology and evolution itself. My worry is that we have to really ditch our addiction to materialism and consumerism for this transformation to occur, however. It's now not just a matter of urgency, but we have people parading in the streets, protesting against climate change, for example. So there is movement afoot, but much more undoubtedly would be required. And then there's the threat, which we can come to, if you wish, of thermonuclear war. And generally we have in like with Hitler and Mao and Joseph Stalin, power-hungry megalomaniacs who want to control everyone and everything, no matter at what cost to human life. We can now no longer afford to have those people in positions of power. They're extremely dangerous, particularly when they have access to nuclear codes.
Well, I can't disagree with you in terms of the politics. However, I'm not sure that political action is very helpful. I remember in the start of the Gulf War, there were huge public protests, but the forces pushing for war didn't seem to care. Here in the United States, 90% of the public wants more regulation on firearms. But the lobbyists and the money people seem to be pulling all the strings. Never happens.
If you'd like, Jeffrey, I'd refer to them somewhat whimsically, perhaps as phallic narcissists, in terms of what these weapons symbolically represent to them.
I think you're talking about phallic symbols.
Yes, indeed.
Some years ago, Peter, I also had the pleasure of interviewing a sociologist, Paul Ray, and he had come up with a very interesting finding that the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population, and I think this is probably true globally, are people he called the cultural creatives. And he said the cultural creatives are divided into two different wings. One is a wing of people who are open to spiritual growth and personal growth, and then there's a political wing. But they seem very separate. They didn't seem to be united, these two wings.
Well, when one considers the underlying ideologies which inspire them, it's not difficult to see why there would be such a system and why that would continue to be perpetuated. Our problem is to move beyond such a system into a position where humanity collectively acts in such a way as to do something about our contribution to climate change, and certainly about the megalomaniacs who might be tempted to use nuclear codes to destroy other countries.
Well, you referred earlier to the important work of Teilhard de Chardin, and as I think about it, Teilhard was a Christian, a deeply devout Christian, and he believed that the figure of Christ itself, served as a kind of attractor, drawing all of humanity into a state, I guess that we could call it something akin to Christ consciousness.
Unanimization and Christ consciousness, and though we're going to talk about the omega point later, I'll have a lot more to say about that, but that's what he meant by the omega point and the divine focus of mind to be achieved by humanity.
And yes, the omega point may be a long way away in the future, but it does seem to me that even in the near term, something like that is happening, could be happening, might be happening, and perhaps it's worth endeavoring, as you say, taking action to see what you and I and other viewers of this discussion can do to help it along.
Well, I think this is where your series is so priceless for humanity, because at least it raises consciousness about the importance of these things and the issues and what might be some of the obstacles to global unanimization and dealing with the threats to our survival, the sixth extinction, as you so eloquently put it.
These people who have inspired you, the Jungians, some of the physicists such as David Bohm and Wolfgang Pauli, did they offer any sort of immediate solutions in terms of social action in the world, things that they thought would be helpful in their lifetimes?
Well, certainly, both Jung and Pauli in their collaboration, and David Bohm and Basil Harley and Pilkanen in their publications, have all, using slightly different language, said much the same thing, and that is the necessity is to restore first psyche or soul to the world from which it has been exorcised since the Enlightenment, and then in restoring psyche or soul to move towards wholeness, where there is an integration of the soul or divinity immanent within us with a transcendent God reality, and also an acknowledgement that we are also material, that there is a material world that we have to conserve and look after rather than pretending it's a mere thought or figment of solipsistic imagination.
I know there's also a strong push from the materialistic side of things. It's not as if those people are sitting on their hands. There's an enormous literature now on what they call transhumanism, the idea that humans and machines are blending into one another. And to my understanding, these people are hardcore materialists. They are not at all interested in the kind of research and theoretical work that you and I have been discussing.
Yes, well, if we turn people into cogs in an icy, cold, mechanistic machine, we then destroy any possibility of recognizing the sacredness of all human beings and of the immanent transcendence or numinous principle that we all carry, albeit unconsciously a lot of the time. That development you've described there about involving mechanization is, I think, particularly maybe covert, but very subtle and profoundly dangerous to our future, because it actually means even more dehumanization and despiritualization of the world and of those who inhabit it.
Let me ask you this question, Peter, since you're there in Australia where you have a large Aboriginal population. Do you find amongst the Indigenous people of Australia more of an awareness of the sacredness of all life?
I suspect that Australia's first people, much as they have been disenfranchised and disadvantaged and stripped of rights, have always held, as far back into their history as we know from what they've told us orally, a sense of almost an animistic experience of the sacredness of the earth and their responsibility for conserving and taking care of it. In fact, they call themselves custodians, meaning guardians of the land. So I think that contribution is important and their voices need to be heard.
I am under the same impression with regard to the indigenous people of North and South America. At the same time, I'm also aware of research that suggests that many of the large mammals that once roamed throughout North America were killed to extinction by prehistoric hunters.
And those extinctions are still occurring because of anthropogenic for anthropogenic reasons. I mean, even, as you know, species like the elephant are nearing extinction because certain nations want to plunder their tusks for ivory. I mean, how's that for hideous consumerism and total desacralization of a whole species, let alone humanity? It's just greed.
So even a culture which, in a larger sense, acknowledges the sacredness of life and is not necessarily going to reach every individual within that culture. There, issues of greed and abuse will probably always be with us.
Well, I think they are basic human shadow qualities, as Carl Jung would put it, and we have to be. What is necessary is that people become conscious of these unconscious and rather destructive parts of the human psyche or soul, the shadow, the collective shadow, and its destructive impact, which of course has been behind the emergence of frightening phenomena like Adolf Hitler and Stalin and Mao and several contemporary world leaders as well.
So, in effect, what you're saying is that it's not just enough to acknowledge the sacredness of all life. We have to, in effect, confront our own shadow. We have to look within ourselves. It's really a process, as Jung would put it, of individuation.
Of individuation and taking back unconscious projections of our own shadow qualities and destructiveness onto the world and onto other people's. Because whilst those collective projections are in place, then it's very easy to rationalise exploiting, using and destroying people for our own purposes, dehumanised in essence to make that rationalisation possible. thank God for the global internet and for programs like yours, because this is at least one means of raising awareness of the necessity of confronting our own human shadow qualities and collective shadow qualities, for that matter.
Well, the kind of, I'll call it shadow work that takes place in Jungian therapy and other forms of depth psychology, and I would venture to say humanistic psychology, existential psychology, has, I would say, to this point in time, these practices are half a century old or more, maybe a whole century. But they've affected really a tiny percentage of people who have the means to participate in that form of therapy. What you're arguing for is something on a much larger scale, and even internet programs such as this one, this conversation that we have, will only reach a tiny fraction of the population. How will it be possible to reach people on a larger scale, Peter?
Two things are contingently necessary for that. One is a collective awakening or emergence from denial and projection of the actual realities that are created by acting upon destructive shadow qualities and destroying the world instead of being creative and contributing to it. And the other is, again, though it may be limited in scope for the moment, potentially this program has a whole global population to inseminate with this type of thinking. Let's hope that others take up the challenge. But I think first we have to raise consciousness. We are no longer living in anachronistic nation states. That, I think, became a relic in the 1950s. What we need, I think, is beginning to happen in some places, and that is a move towards seeing the world as a whole, holism in the sense that you referred to in the interview, holism, and moving towards unanimization or unity of the human species, not just of small groups or people with tribal identifications, but species identification and God identification, as Jung put it in one of his last essays, Answer to Job.
Well, I know you indicated earlier toward the beginning of this interview that it's important not to be discouraged, that it might be easy to feel like the situation is hopeless and there's nothing that can be done. I am reminded of a statement made by Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, who once said, never think that a small group of people can't change the world because it's never happened any other way.
Well, I'd make two comments in response to that, David, apart from agreeing with Margaret Mead. Yes, history is replete of evidence of movements, whether religious or otherwise, which began with relatively small groups of people and yet became eventually part of the consciousness of whole countries, like the conversion of Constantine led to the Christianization of Europe. And although we may have some reservations about that, that's an example of a movement that began with an enlightened being, which became part of the consciousness of a whole empire. And there are many other examples in history. I want to refer back though to something you mentioned about humanistic and transpersonal psychology. I'm aware that you've had a big hand in promoting those ideas and received an award for your contributions. And I think back to Abraham Maslow's work on self-actualization. And he's so close in many ways to Jung, though he doesn't necessarily embrace a numinous dimension. I think he's probably a bit agnostic. But he's so close to Jung in talking about the hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, and peak identity experiences, meaning mystical experiences at the top. So I suspect that even though he may not have actually articulated this as a manifestation of some numinous reality, I think that's what he was getting at. I mean, what are peak experiences of identity except mystical connection with a reality beyond one's own finite ego? I admire Abraham Maslow's work very much.
He was a big influence on me, and he made a point of saying that these peak experiences were virtually indistinguishable from mystical experiences.
Indeed. So I think the world needs many more peak experiences and many more mystical experiences. And might I just add, whilst I think of it, as a person who's experienced an NDE and had a remarkable personal transformation as a result, I have this enhanced sense of connection with humanity and with the world as a whole, and a sense of urgency in using the rest of my life anyway, however limited it may be, to contribute to this type of movement towards a more global type of mystical experience. It may even become an example of what Roderick Mayne and others are referring to as a panentheistic, evolutionary panentheistic religion or spirituality.
Well, the fact that you've had such an experience means that you're not just speaking from the many books that you've obviously read. You're speaking because you've had a direct experience of the sacredness of life and the infinity of consciousness itself.
Yes, very much in line with the notion that the universe is infinite and that the human psyche, our spirituality is coextensive with the cosmos itself. I think that's Carl Jung's phrasing, actually. But to see ourselves as part of something that's coextensive with the entire cosmos is rather a shift in awareness from our narrow preoccupations from the perspective of the ego.
Well, Peter, Todd, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you again today. I know that we're going to be having another conversation on the Omega Point as described not only in Christian theology, but also in the work of Teilhard de Chardin. So once again, it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope I've managed to heighten the awareness of a few people.